Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at the incredible, uh, often surprising story of how Apple built its massive manufacturing operation.
Yeah, I mean, the company whose devices, let's face it, you probably have one right near you now.
Exactly. And it's a story that's just completely intertwined with China, a relationship that, well, it's been hugely successful.
Hugely. But now it's facing some pretty significant challenges and, frankly, risks.
Right. So to help us unpack this, what are we looking at?
We've pulled from a bunch of sources, articles, reports, and some really fascinating bits from Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China.
Ah, the capture of the world's greatest company. Yeah.
That's the one. It does a great job really digging into this, complex dependency.
Okay. So our mission here is to understand how Apple got so reliant on China for making its stuff, what some of the kind of unexpected consequences were,
Yeah, things maybe they didn't see coming.
and what it all means now for Apple's future and, the bigger global picture. Okay, let's get into it.
What's really interesting, I think, is that the story everyone knows is Jobs and Ive, the design gurus.
Right, the icons.
But the sources really highlight another crucial partnership. It's Tim Cook's operational genius.
Mm.
Paired with Terry Gou, the founder of Foxconn, he's often called the manufacturing genius who actually made the iPhone possible at massive scale.
Bringing it to the masses, yeah. And initially, the pull towards China seems, well, obvious.
Pretty straightforward on the surface. The sources point out you had local governments, Taiwanese suppliers, all really eager to create this ecosystem.
Offering deals.
Big time. Incentives, subsidies, basically rolling out the red carpet to lure Apple in. And back then, the perception, honestly, was often framed as, low wages, low welfare, low human rights.
A place where suppliers could tap into that huge migrant worker pool.
Exactly. And authorities could, well, keep things quiet if there was unrest.
But that's shifted, hasn't it? China isn't just the low-wage place anymore.
No, definitely not. And that's key. Tim Cook himself has talked about this. The importance now isn't just cheap labor, it's the legions of skilled workers.
Right, and that ecosystem didn't just, pop up overnight.
Oh, God, no. It took decades to build. We're talking not just giant factories, but all the sub-suppliers nearby training this massive army of skilled engineers.
So trying to copy that somewhere else, say back in the U.S.
Incredibly difficult. The sources stress it needs a really long-term strategic view, like investing heavily in vocational education, that kind of thing.
And Terry Gu's approach sounds pretty intense.
Unique is one word for it. He started Honhai Plastics literally from a shed, learned to make components himself just to cut costs,
Wow.
and driven by this almost military focus on efficiency. Sources talk about lines where talking was banned, meticulous defect counting, grueling 12-hour shifts.
And he had that little red book of sayings.
Yeah, stuff like work hard on the job today, or work hard to find a job tomorrow, or that really intense one, achieve goals, or the sun will no longer rise.
Yikes. Talk about pressure.
But here's a crucial insight Gu had, according to the sources. He knew the real value of working with Apple wasn't just the profit margin.
Which was tiny at first, right?
Razor's thin sometimes. The real gold was the learning, the tacit knowledge his teams got working side by side with Apple engineers.
The know-how.
Exactly. He was playing the long game. He figured if they could satisfy Apple's crazy demands, they could handle anyone.
And Apple's demands were legendary, driven by Jony Ive's designs especially.
Oh, yeah. The sources give great examples, like the original iMac, that eggshell shape, and engineers were like, you literally can't make it this shape.
So they had to compromise.
Compromises, finding specialist contractors. It was a headache. Or the first iPod, that polished stainless steel back.
Looked amazing.
Looked amazing, but getting enough capacity, it tied up practically every machine shop in Taiwan.
So that intense design focus basically forced Apple to get really close with its suppliers.
Incredibly close. Intimately, you could say.
Yeah.
Sources describe Apple engineers practically living in these factories.
Figuring out new ways to actually make this stuff.
Totally. Coming up with new processes, even getting Apple to fund expensive equipment that didn't even exist yet.
Which created dependency,
It's
obviously.
a huge dependency. But it also meant the suppliers learned incredibly fast. And Cook, being Cook, also built in redundancy, teaching multiple vendors the same tricky processes. Smart operational move.
Speaking of Cook, his operational focus sounds almost mythical.
Relentless is the word. Sources call him a Terminator machine for spotting errors in spreadsheets, demanding insane efficiency.
He wanted inventory measured in.
Hours, not days. Forget weeks or days. Hours. His questioning could go layers deep, forcing people to really, really know their stuff.
You hear stories about the pressure on the engineers, the trips to Asia.
Oh, yeah. Constant long trips. They even had specific bonuses nicknamed Dan Bucks, apparently just to smooth things over with spouses back home.
And these weren't small bonuses.
No. Sources mention like $500, maybe even $1,000 a day. Even during COVID, they were flying engineers over on private jets with limited seats, facing tough quarantines. The dedication was intense.
Thinking about those early suppliers, Inventec struggled at first in China.
Yeah, the sources mentioned they didn't even have internet in the factory initially. Huge problem for Apple, obviously. And there was apparently some shady business with refurbished iPods hitting the gray market.
Right, but Foxconn saw the opening.
They really did. They basically orchestrated their own job interview for the iPod business, proved they could handle the volume, the quality, and overcame some early sort of anti-Foxconn feelings inside Apple.
And the quality demands Apple set. Just unheard of.
Completely. Get this. Sources say 2/3 of the entire iPhone production line was just for testing.
2/3.
Yeah. Compared to maybe one test station for Nokia back then, Apple had 50. 50. The goal was absolute perfection, making sure the 30 millionth iPhone was identical to the first.
That level of control is just, wow.
It shows how hard Apple pushed its partners, not just on how many, but how well they were made. Another quick example, the first iPhone almost didn't launch on time.
Why? What happened?
Late in the game, they found a SAR issue radiation levels. With only like 3-4 months left, engineers scrambled.
What did they do?
Had to move components, add these 3 special copper cables inside. Jobs was apparently furious about the fix,
I bet.
but he had to accept it for version 1, promising a proper fix later. Just shows the constant design meets manufacturing crunch.
So Apple builds this absolute manufacturing beast in China, teaching suppliers incredible scale and precision. But then, the market itself throws a curveball.
A massive one. Because Apple's initial view of the China market, surprisingly cautious, even dismissive.
Really? How?
It was ranked as a 3rd priority, below places like Argentina, Uruguay.
Seriously?
Seriously. The assumption was simple. The iPhone's just too expensive for the average Chinese consumer, even with wages going up.
But that wasn't the reality at all.
Not even close. The sources say executives were completely stunned. Demand was just absolutely staggering.
And China quickly became...
Apple's biggest market outside the U.S. fast.
Why? What was the draw if it was so expensive?
One powerful reason. It became this potent status symbol. There's this amazing story in the source material about a post office worker spending 30% of his yearly salary on an iPhone.
30%?
Yeah, and he said owning it meant he was not just a mailman. That just perfectly captures it, doesn't it? It wasn't just about income, it was aspiration, identity.
And that kind of demand must have created chaos.
Absolute chaos. Sources paint this vivid picture of a huge gray market run by yellow cows. That's the local term for scalpers. They'd organize migrant workers, bust them in sometimes to line up, buy the 2 phones they were allowed per ID. Especially in Hong Kong, no sales tax there.
So huge crowds, problems at the stores.
Intense crowds, near riots, even violence. One source just called it an unbelievable circus.
There's that story about the Apple retail exec, John Ford.
Yeah, trying to manage this madness in Beijing. He gets into an altercation, state media reports it. Suddenly, it's this potential international incident.
Wow.
He even apparently offered to be arrested to protect a local official. And you could feel his frustration with Cupertino asking things like, well, why not just call the police? Like, they had no idea what it was really like on the ground.
And the irony, the sources point out, is Apple's own interviews found customers had low reported incomes.
Right, but it made 0 difference to sales. Just highlights how culturally significant that product became.
Okay, so Apple's using China for manufacturing, finds this unexpected gold mine of a market. But then there's this other argument, the core one from McGee's book especially.
Exactly. The argument is that Apple didn't just benefit from China.
It made China.
It helped make China the tech manufacturing powerhouse it is today through massive technology transfer.
How did that work? Tacit knowledge.
Precisely. That deep hands-on knowledge, the engineering skills, the process secrets gained by suppliers working so closely with Apple, it just got absorbed.
And it wasn't just company to company.
No, the argument is it was almost country to country, kind of like how Taiwanese companies learned from Japan earlier, then applied it in mainland China.
And the huge consequence of that.
Well, as Apple trained its suppliers to make perfect components, those suppliers then turned around and offered that same expertise to the rising Chinese companies.
Like Huawei, Xiaomi?
Exactly. Huawei, Xiaomi, Vivo, Oppo. The argument goes that Apple, in effect, gave birth to the Chinese smartphone industry.
Wow, so their market share shoots up.
Dramatically. And some argue it was these Chinese rivals, trained by Apple's supply chain methods, not the iPhone itself, that really finished off Nokia in China.
And this fits with China's broader strategy, right?
Perfectly. The sources are clear. The party's reform program was designed to lure in Western firms, not just for jobs, but to learn, to reverse engineer, replicate, and eventually replace. The explicit goal was indigenous innovation.
There's also a financial angle pointing this way.
Yeah, a really interesting one. Apple has actually decreased its investment in things like buildings and machinery, long-lived assets in China since about 2018.
Really?
The value dropped significantly. It suggests Apple's letting the Chinese suppliers, the red supply chain, foot more of the bill for the really expensive cutting-edge equipment now.
Which helps Apple's margins.
Sure, helps the bottom line. But it also means the Chinese supply chain is investing deeper, getting even more capable and independent.
And this deep, deep entanglement leads straight to what the sources call the biggest risk Apple faces now.
Yeah, the argument isn't about U.S. tariffs, not really. The biggest existential threat, it's Beijing.
It's a catch-22, isn't it? Uncouple too fast, you anger them, wait too long.
It gets even harder, maybe impossible. And the CCP has shown it will use its leverage. That CCTV media attack in 2013 is a classic example.
That was coordinated.
Sources say journalists were pre-briefed by the Ministry of Commerce. It totally blindsided Apple, starkly revealed the supply chain as this massive vulnerability.
And Apple's initial reaction didn't work.
No, playing it cool failed. It ended with Tim Cook issuing a formal apology in Mandarin and reportedly a secret meeting where he had to lose face and bow, a clear signal of who held the power.
And there were other examples of this pressure.
Definitely. Like Apple's iTunes and iBook stores just being shut down abruptly in 2016, or the 2017 cybersecurity law.
That forced them into a data joint venture, right? First time for Apple.
Yeah, a big concession showing their leverage wasn't what it used to be.
And they've had to remove apps.
Lots of apps, news sites, VPNs, basically doing censorship work for the government by taking things off the App Store.
That perspective from Doug Guthrie, the guy who worked for Apple in Shanghai.
Super insightful. He realized the party's watching closely, that the goal was always learning to replicate. He saw regulations, labor laws, environmental rankings, not just as rules, but as leverage.
Especially since Apple didn't have that formal JV label like other companies.
Right. He felt that made them more of a target. And his conclusion was that CSR, corporate social responsibility, in China isn't really bottom-up. It's a top-down project that ultimately serves the CCP's agenda.
And after his research, Apple signed that huge MOU.
Yeah, that non-binding $275 billion memorandum of understanding with the government. Sources called it music to the ears of China. Apple essentially playing Prometheus, handing over the fire, committing to investments that align perfectly with Beijing's goals.
Which maybe influenced China letting Tesla build its own factory later.
The sources suggest that, yeah, China saw how well the Apple entanglement worked for them, getting technology and know-how, so maybe they decided letting Tesla in solo serve their interests too.
And the political climate now under Xi Jinping.
Stark. He's consolidated power immensely. Some call him another Putin in the making. Things like the tech crackdowns, zero COVID. They showed absolute control.
And Tim Cook's silence on China questions.
It's seen as very telling, just how beholden Apple has become. Criticizing the government could jeopardize everything instantly.
So putting it all together, where does that leave Apple today? Geopolitics are tense.
Incredibly tense. Constant warnings about conflict, and the sources are blunt. Apple is probably the most exposed Western company if there's a major disruption.
Especially anything hitting Taiwan and TSMC.
Exactly. A political crisis, even a natural disaster there. The impact on Apple, reliant on TSMC for chips, would be catastrophic.
They are trying to diversify though, right? India, Vietnam.
They are, yes, slowly. Sources mention iPhones being made in India, but it's still a tiny fraction, often just final assembly.
And sometimes it's Chinese factories that have just moved with Apple.
That's reported too, yeah. Chinese subsidiaries setting up shop in India or Vietnam. And there are even whispers China might be subtly slowing down these supply chain shifts, maybe depending on the U.S. political winds.
And just recreating that China ecosystem, it's incredibly hard.
Immensely hard. Look at the Mac Pro factory in Texas. The sources call it an unmitigated fiasco. Painful, embarrassing.
Getting parts took months instead of hours.
Exactly. Custom parts that would just appear overnight in Shenzhen took ages in Texas. Shows the gap in speed and maturity. And suppliers trying to shift production, it costs billions. And they face potential obstruction from Beijing. Plus, those reports of Chinese firms trying to illegally poach talent from Taiwan.
Trying to grab that know-how.
Right, to replicate advanced skills and maybe weaken competitors?
What about TSMC building factories in Arizona? Does that help?
Potentially. Long term, it adds some resilience. But even TSMC's founder, Morris Chang, sounded skeptical, called it potentially an expensive exercise in futility because of costs and challenges.
And U.S. politics could change things there, too.
Absolutely. Industrial policy, subsidies, it's not a guaranteed fix. So when you step back and look at this whole story, what does it really tell us? It's not just about Apple's logistics.
No, it feels like bigger.
It's a massive case study, really, on globalization, the huge strategic risks of getting tangled up with authoritarian states.
And the tension between just chasing efficiency and profit.
Versus thinking about the wider consequences, geopolitical and societal.
And you can't forget the human side throughout. The migrant workers early on, the factory conditions, the engineers under pressure.
Those Dan bucks.
Yeah. And the chaos at the stores. There's a real human cost and drama baked into this whole system that gets us our phones.
You know, you could almost draw a parallel to GE under Jack Welch. That relentless drive for efficiency, shareholder value, above all, massive offshoring.
Which had huge impacts back home, like in the Rust Belt.
Exactly. It echoes that same story of deindustrialization and its consequences, just on a maybe even bigger, more globally intertwined scale.
Which brings us back to that central irony, the one the book review highlighted. Apple isn't really dependent on the advantages it found in China anymore.
Like the cheap labor way back when.
Right. It's dependent on the world-class capabilities it created there.
Capabilities that now power its biggest competitors.
And are ultimately controlled by a government that poses a major strategic risk. It's quite a situation. So we've really gone deep into this complex, often surprising story of Apple and China, from the factory floor dynamics right up to geopolitics.
It's such a clear example of how these global supply chains are way more than just moving boxes around. They're shaped by history, politics, ambition, immense human effort.
It really is.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty big question, I think. Given these strategic risks, these incredibly deep entanglements, this system Apple helped build, can a company like this really uncouple from it now in any meaningful way? And what does that mean for all of us, for the products we use every single day? It raises an important question.
It absolutely does. Definitely something to think about next time you pick up your phone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.